A Bond fan? Oh yeah. Giddy, lifelong 007 fanboy since childhood, while at the same time being a critical, progressive film snob. It's like a war in my brain. Hello, my name's Chris, what's yours? Welcome to my channel, and yes, I am a Bond fan. And I've got a complicated relationship with James Bond. Because, now I think about it, I've always been a little bit reticent to admit that I'm a James Bond fan. Now, I'm perfectly fine with being considered a nerd. Doesn't bother me, not one jot. I'm a Doctor Who fan with no shame whatsoever. In fact, I'm currently embarking on a Doctor Who marathon from the very beginning. But I think Doctor Who, Marvel, Star Trek and Wars, they kind of go hand in hand with being a nerd. But Bond? It always feels like it sits outside of any sort of definition. It's its own thing. And maybe because it doesn't fall into any easily categorised type of fandom besides its own bespoke one, I sometimes hesitate to put my hand up and admit that yes, I am a James Bond fan. Or maybe it's because that even though James Bond has been around for over 60 years on the screen and over 70 years on the page, it has, despite how lucrative the franchise has been after all that time and how it revolutionised both those media, it's strangely never felt all that popular. But it's one of the highest grossing franchises of all time, Chris. Yeah, and every property needs your casual moviegoers and your regular Joes to buy tickets to see it. But I'm talking about it being considered popular to be a lifelong card-carrying, dyed-in-the-wool, tuxedoed through and through Bond fanboy. Maybe it's just me, but it has never felt as accepted as being a fan of all the other stuff. A new Bond film is an event that most people go to see, sure. And I'll be able to speak to a large number of people who've gone to see it at the cinema. But if you know your Ken Adams from your Peter Lamonts just from geometric shapes in the ceiling, or if you're well versed in the intricacies of the McClory Thunderball Spectre rights issues, then you struggle to find other people on the same level. It doesn't seem to be that there's that many of us. Almost like it's a bridge too far. Which is why, maybe, being a part of different fan communities, the James Bond one feels slightly more close-knit. Now, I hold my hands up and say maybe that all of this is internalised, but having been indoctrinated into the world of James Bond by my granddad in the late 1980s, I was definitely the only Bond fan I remember at school. Even if everyone thought that GoldenEye was the bee's knees when it came out in 95, and again when the game came out a couple of years later, they were never into the old stuff. So the older I got, I just sort of kept it to myself, mainly because there was no opportunities to really talk about it, rather than any sense of shame. And it's not like my encyclopedic knowledge of James Bond that I had built up was going anywhere. Seriously, even today, if I went on Mastermind and obviously had to choose a specialised subject, I would still probably choose James Bond. I consumed and absorbed everything as a kid, and it's all still floating about in here. And in here. And, well, I will try and phrase this as delicately as possible while at the same time reminding you that I am definitively a James Bond fan and that I do love James Bond. Getting older also meant shall we say, a refining of critical faculties, and a lot of criticisms that I heard or read that were levelled at the franchise, misogyny, racism, disability shaming, apart from just being ludicrous, repetitive, formulaic and silly, I sometimes found them hard to argue with. But try telling that to my inner child who I was still carrying around with me, whose grandfather passed away before he had a chance to see GoldenEye, and to whom James Bond was still a palpable link. And while I say that certain criticisms of the Bond films and the Bond books are valid, some of them, not all of them, seem to confuse character for property. And some of them, not all of them, seem to still think that they're making the Bond films like it's still the 1970s and writing the Bond books like it's still the 1950s. When you and I both know they're not. Everything evolves, and neither the literary nor cinematic 007 would have continued this long if they hadn't moved with the times. Bond himself can remain a man with flaws and prejudices that we don't necessarily agree with. It was part of the point of him anyway, and why he's such an interesting character. But the films are currently in the stewardship of quite possibly one of the strongest women currently working in the film industry. I think that what I'm trying to say is that, like a lot of stuff from a bygone era, 70 years is a long old time. Certain aspects from James Bond's past have obviously not aged particularly well. And to ignore these or deny them is to do James Bond a discredit and to do us a discredit as fans. But equally, to write off the whole thing because of certain elements like that, when there are equally, if not more, elements that have aged well, or even in some cases, were ahead of their time. To criticise the current filmic output, sporadic though it is, as if it was exactly the same as it was decades ago, is at best naive, and at worst willfully ignorant. So the ones which I think confuse the character for James Bond with the concept of James Bond are the ones that are usually, to be fair, levelled typically at the superficiality of some of the films. Now, in Fleming's original books, even though he himself did hold some extreme views that did occasionally bleed into his writing, James Bond is portrayed as a character far more complex than some of the later films might have you believe, with the writing being far more knowing than is often discussed. And yeah, while some of the women in the films have little role besides looking pretty in a bikini, when James Bond falls in love in the books, as happens several times, it's written with a tenderness and an emotional complexity that either critics these days just ignore or haven't done their due diligence and realise is there. And that tenderness and emotional complexity can actually be quite jarring these days when you consider the global perception of James Bond as some kind of just emotionless, womanising action cipher. And that only goes to show how sort of warped the global perception of James Bond as a character had become. One of the central tenets of the character, as laid down originally back at the very beginning by his very creator, had come to feel like a departure. Now, do I agree with Ian Fleming when he goes off on one about the personality defects of certain ethnicities? Absolutely not. Of course not. As a child, I just didn't notice these things, and I thought the films were simply badass and exciting. And that is something that will stick with me forever. I mean, I still think the films are badass and exciting, but as an adult with a more developed critical eye, I can't overlook those elements that make me go, I don't agree with Fleming going off on one about the personality defects of certain ethnicities, so I'm not going to ignore it. But this exercise isn't just about noticing the flaws that certain detractors are obviously very quick to point out. It's also highlighting certain elements that those detractors will either by accident or on purpose just overlook. Because there are also a litany of positives that get overlooked and that also sailed over my head as a child. Characters like Honey Rider and Tracy DiVincenzo are written in the books and performed in the films with far more agency and strength than was usual, enough to match James Bond and in some instances even better him. There are times when he has to rely on these women to save his life and get him out of things. He would be dead several times over if it weren't for these characters. And while that's true many times in the films, mostly of the female leads, there are obviously examples where women are just window dressing, which will clearly leave a bad taste as time goes on. And as such, yeah, I do cringe a little bit at certain points, and I can't deny that my beloved franchise doing such things does, very occasionally, embarrass me. But I love it with all of my heart, and I trust it enough to get there. If it had stayed in its ways in the 1950s and the 1960s, as so many would have you believe that it did, then it simply would not be around today. It is the burden of anything this long-lived to have a checkered history, but it is that checkered history which shapes the future. And James Bond did shape the future, both of spy literature and, more seismically, the language of cinema. Some of the most iconic imagery of all time, courtesy of the signature gun barrel, trippy opening titles, incredible practical effects and stunts, along with some of the most iconic film music of all time, courtesy of the pounding James Bond theme and litany of title songs, and defining tropes such as pre-credit sequences and darkly humorous gags among pitch dark material. They've all combined to make James Bond almost a genre by itself. And maybe that's why its fandom stands alone. James Bond stands alone. And it's got so many elements that it originated that plenty of films and books in the same genre or which try to occupy the same space have sought to emulate over the years. So yes, despite flaws that I know are there, I do still love it. I love it for its excitement, I love it for its inventiveness, and I love it for its uniqueness. And for its ability to take me back in time and, in some way, bring my granddad back to life. But since when was being a fan ever truly straightforward? Sure, I'm a fanboy, but I'm not just acutely aware of some of the criticisms levelled at James Bond over the years, I even agree with some of them. And it isn't even that I have to ignore them or look past them or brush them aside to continue being a James Bond fan. I do fully accept many of them. It's just that, well, we know we're not in the 1960s anymore and we don't behave like we are. And neither does James Bond. Like the character himself, the books and the movies have flaws. But like the flaws of the character himself, I consider them, I acknowledge their presence. I don't necessarily defend them if I don't agree with them. And I therefore just sort of think that they contribute to a whole that's been going for 7 decades now. It's into its 8th decade. I obviously love James Bond. Wouldn't make this video if I didn't. The editing of the Fleming novels, for instance, was a recent topic. Now, while I understand completely the argument that they shouldn't be edited, you should leave them as they were, those are the works of art, that is also an opinion I personally subscribe to. From what I've just said, hopefully you can glean that I think editing out these elements isn't exactly the right way to go. However, like I said, times change, and this is part of that changing through time. Those originals aren't going anywhere. I've got them all on my shelf over there. If this is a way of ensnaring new audiences to James Bond and highlighting the positives towards them, that can only be a good thing. But my point, my overall point, I think, is that there are elements of James Bond's past that we shouldn't jettison. And we should embrace their presence as something which will make the future more accessible. And basically to secure the future of James Bond by addressing these points and hopefully sort of like addressing them head on, James Bond's future is secured. The future of the films is maybe not to some fans' tastes, but it is informed by James Bond's past. The DNA of James Bond goes straight from 1953 all the way through till now, and that is wonderful. And I use the words for better or for worse because, yeah, there are some elements that maybe, they definitely haven't aged very well, but they are an important part of James Bond's history, and they're an important part of where he is now. So the presence of these flaws and acknowledging their presence is, I think, really important in the growth and the maturity of the James Bond franchise, both literary and cinematic. So, by making this video, my complicated relationship with James Bond just got simpler. The bottom line is, I love it. And therefore, of course, I know all of its historical failings. But crucially, I also know all of its historical triumphs. And its historical triumphs tend not to get mentioned as much by critics of the whole Bond phenomenon. As fans, we know full well what it has been capable of and what it can be capable of. To help better understand my complex mix of thoughts and emotions when it comes to James Bond, I'd like to examine its evolution, the franchise and the character. So, I will be embarking on a 007 Supermarathon from 1953 to the present day. So, this won't just be an every film in order marathon, I'll be looking at every book, film and TV adaptation individually in the order they were released, as well as dipping into other Bond products in other media along the way, such as comic books, radio plays and video games, which come along between the tentpole releases. And I'm really looking forward to it. I've seen the films countless times. I've read the Fleming novels several times over. The continuation novels I've only ever read once, either upwards of 20 years ago or when they were released. And I've never read any of the young Bond novels. I'm not particularly a massive gamer, so the James Bond video games, aside from a couple, they're new to me as well. I guess I'm just really excited about working my way through this canon, as I've never done that before. This will be a first time, and also I'm really looking forward to the insights it's going to give me about the evolution of the James Bond phenomenon, and how it might affect my perceptions and enjoyment of it. And from this video, I hope that you can trust me that I won't just be uncritical and kind for the sake of it, but also know that I am going to be taking that inner child along for the ride with me. So I won't be bashing things for the sake of it either. This will be both a dispassionate and enthusiastic look at the history of James Bond. Simultaneously, a subjective and objective journey through the entire back catalogue from a giddy 007 fanboy and a snobby critical progressive. Ugh. Both of them me, by the way. I hope you'll come on the journey with me, beginning very soon with the novel Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. So if you don't want to miss that or any of the subsequent steps on the James Bond Supermarathon, then hit the subscribe button, bong the bell, and I'll meet you in 1953.